Hello and welcome to the Spring 2021 Digital Program Series presented by the Corry Higher Education Council. My name is Brody Howard. I'm the Executive Director of the Corry Higher Education Council and will be your host for today's program. Since its incorporation on May 31st, 1991, the Corry Higher Education Council has provided education, training, and workforce development to the greater Corry community. The second community education council to be formed, Corry Hi-Ed, is one of 9 CECs currently operating through the Commonwealth that serve largely rural and educationally underserved communities across the state. Today's presentation, titled The History of the Corry Higher Education Council, will look back at the rich 30-year history of the council leading up to its anniversary commemoration. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two former executive directors of the Corry Higher Education Council, Peggy McCarthy and Steve Bishop. Peggy serving as the council's first full-time director from 1991 to 1996, and Steve as the council's longest-serving director from 1996 to 2018. Welcome to you both. I am very happy that you'll be able to both join us today to look back at the 30 years of success here at Corry Hi-Ed. Steve, the first question is for you. You have a very unique perspective of the council, covering it as a reporter for the Corry Journal and also serving as its director. Would you take us through some of the key historical moments leading up to the development and eventual incorporation of the Hi-Ed in 1991, and also identify some of the key contributors to the early existence of the council?
Sure, Brody, and thanks for putting all this together. So, as you said, I was working as a reporter at the Corry Journal when this all got started, and the genesis for it was that Corry, which is a manufacturing community, was really being hard hit economically in the mid to late 1980s. And one of the community leaders, Paul Hoop Roach from Erie Plastics, wanted to be proactive about all these, kind of negative things that were going on in the community in terms of plant closings and layoffs. And so he formed a group called the Corry Industrial Roundtable. And the idea behind it was not only industrial leaders, but just community leaders in general. And I covered it for the Corry Journal. And Hoop wanted, as I said, to be proactive. So the roundtable started talking about things that it might be able to do to, or things that it could control, since it couldn't control the overall economy, to improve the Corry area. Someone, and I'm not sure who, in that initiative became aware of an initiative in Warren called the Warren Forest Higher Education Council, and decided to go take a look at that. So a group from Corry went over to Warren and talked to the executive director of that initiative, Judy Shade, and found that the Warren Forest High-Ed was started in 1984. And they looked at what it was doing, delivering education and training to the Warren area, and came back to Corry and said, we think we should do this. We think this would be a good thing for Corry. And one of the key players at the time was State Senator John Peterson. And I recall at our 5-year anniversary of the Hi-Ed Council that Senator Peterson spoke about the origins of the community education councils. And he noted that in Warren, they had some kind of an outreach of Edinburgh University back in the, 70s and early 80s. And Edinburgh had pulled out of Warren. And so he was getting a lot of, pressure from the Warren community to do something. How could they bring education, an educational presence back to Warren? So he had some contact with someone at Penn State University, and who had an idea for this kind of a model, a nonprofit organization that could be a facilitator, a gatekeeper of educational opportunities for a community. So the folks came back from Warren to Corry and said, hey, we think we should do this. And one of the principals, there were several people involved. I don't know who they all were, but one of the key individuals was then Corry Superintendent of Schools, Bill Nichols, who I'm pretty sure went on to become the first president of the board of directors of the Corry Higher Council. And they decided to incorporate this new entity, this new nonprofit. And the original incorporators, there were 3 original incorporators of the Hi-Ed, and they were Michael Allen, the late Michael Allen, who at the time had worked for the Corry Redevelopment Authority. And Hoop Roach was a second incorporator. And then the third incorporator was John Chip Caldwell from Rossbacker Insurance. So those 3 men were the original incorporators of the Hi-Ed. And, you know, as I covered it from the reporter's perspective, and then later became executive director, I really thought it was one of the best grassroots, one of the best and most important grassroots initiatives that I had ever seen, certainly in Corry. Those individuals who went out and started this nonprofit really did it on a kind of a wing and a prayer. I mean, they did it as just a good faith effort. They didn't know exactly what this thing was going to look like, or exactly what it was going to do, or how they were going to pay for it. They just knew that Corry needed this educational facilitator. They knew that Corry needed more educational opportunities. So, you know, they just kind of put themselves out there, incorporated the organization, and then got started. And I will add that you know, obviously they didn't know how they were going to pay for it. Senator Peterson was able to get funding for the Warren Forest High-Ed Council, you know, sporadically, and you know, through what they at the time called WAM money, or walking around money, and able to get that funded. And I'm sure they had community support in Warren. But here in Corry, Hoop went out and did a little mini fund drive to really get this thing off the ground. And he was able to get commitments from 5 manufacturers in Corry. They were, of course, Erie Plastics, his own company, and Corry Manufacturing, and Viking Plastics, and Corry Contract, and McGinnis Steel, and got them all to commit $5,000 a year for 5 years as really seed money to help get this initiative off the ground. So, you know, the manufacturing community was behind the Corry Hi-Ed from day one, continued to support it through the years. But so that's really how this whole thing got started.
Peggy, thank you again for joining us. The next question is for you. After Mike Allen served as the initial executive director on an interim basis, you served as the first full-time executive director of Corry Hi-Ed from 1991 to 1996. Could you share with us your experience and some of the standout memories that you have in this role?
Sure, and it was a very, very positive experience. I was immediately impressed with cooperation between all the leaders within the Corry community. Volunteer board members, businesses and industries, educational institutions, and potential funding entities all had the same understanding of what they wanted as the end result for the formation of the Corry Hi-Ed Council. But as Steve said, they weren't really sure how to accomplish it. It was a very, very grassroots effort, and there was a lot of faith in the program, and they just went forward and forged the pathway. They wanted to hire someone that was experienced in higher education. That I did know, and how to form the necessary partnerships that were going to be needed. And they pointed to the Warren Higher Council as a model that could be used, but they were very adamant that Warren and Corry were not exactly the same, and the Corry Higher Council should reflect Corry's needs, strengths, and differences, especially when it came to that particular time when they had been hard hit with unemployment, jobs lost, people moving out of the area. what I remember, a major aspect of the formation of the council was that they had been promised funding for the project from Senator John Peterson. Well, he was a congressman at the time, a state congressman, who later became a senator. That funding was important because it was used to leverage local funding sources, as Steve referred to, those major companies that put money into that. And I was glad to know this as the incoming executive director, because it could have been perceived as a shaky start, but I was so impressed with the commitment that they had and the way they were going about everything that my worries were alleviated immediately. In addition, what I remember, Mercyhurst University had been the only higher education provider at the time in Corry and established course offerings, and they had a base of students. And so in my mind, there was significant support and infrastructure for the formation of the Hi-Ed Council. And then of course, acquiring the building was another story, which we'll get to a little bit later. But there were so many people that were involved in this initiative, and everyone was on the same page. They just wanted to provide better opportunities for the people of Corry and accessible. Corry is 30 miles from Erie, 30 miles from Warren, 30 miles from Titusville, and that wasn't going to make things accessible for the people that needed it the most. I'm thinking standout memories. You had asked me about the standout memories, and I had to go back a ways because it's been a while. But I do remember the board members and the incorporators were extremely supportive in every way possible. They were not micromanagers. They depended on experience and knowledge in that area to put this together. Not only did they do their part in raising funds, they supported me in the forming of the structure of the organization, and I really appreciated that. What I had to do was identify the local education needs, the educational needs of the people that were unemployed. I needed to form important partnerships with educational organizations to offer programming. Not only Mercyhurst, because Mercyhurst had their limits on what they could offer there. We had to offer what was needed and where the jobs were going to be. Raising funds to support the right programming, the needs that were going to be required in having the building, the Corry Hotel. And they accompanied me to meetings whenever it was possible so that they could be knowledgeable, but not micromanagers. No, not in any way, shape, or form were the people that supported this effort. I wanted to add there was another organization that was very important in this, especially for the funding, was Northwest Savings and Loan, which now is not operational in Corry, but they provided, I'm trying to go back if it was a mortgage perhaps for the building at a very reasonable rate, but they were definitely involved, and they did. I think they contributed that $5,000 a year. I could be wrong on that, Steve, but.
Well, I think, Peggy, what you're referring to instead of Northwest at the time was actually Corry Savings Bank.
Corry Savings, exactly.
Yeah, Corry Savings and Loan. Yeah, they were left, the hotel had gone out of business, and the Corry Savings and Loan was left kind of owning it, and they didn't own it. They obviously, it was a big kind of an albatross for them, but when this new education council got created, I know that they approached the board of the Hi-Ed and said, hey, what do you think about, you guys owning this building? And I can only imagine the board at that time, who didn't have two nickels to rub together, looking at this big building with all this, 20 years of deferred maintenance on it and going, who, us? You want us to own this? But I know that the bank and Mr. Nichols at the time, who ran the bank, said, look, we'll give you the best deal we can on buying it, and then we will become financial contributors, supporters of the Hi-Ed Council. And for years, they, and then when they merged with Northwest, were significant financial contributors to and supporters of the Education Council. So, it was a win-win. They got it off their books.
Right.
And then if you recall, I believe it was, so you had a mortgage at the time, and then I think it was the Arlene Smith Foundation that stepped in and paid off the mortgage, right? So you were able to be debt-free, as far as the building goes. So yeah, a lot of significant players and community support, and you can see, in some of the pictures here from that time, the hotel needed a lot of work, and even to this day, it just continues on.
And
That's exactly right. Yeah.
That led right into my next question for you, Peggy, just some of your memories about, the council continues to operate out of the iconic Smith Education Center here in the former Corry Hotel we just discussed here on 221 North Center. What were some of those memories that you would like to add to there as just how the council came to occupy the historical building? You both provided some of that here in just some of those details, but what was it like after acquiring the building and then really moving the organization in there and operating out of there in the early days?
Well, what was really important was matching what programming was going to be needed there to the renovations of the building, instead of just, doing one big renovation and upgrading everything. We had to take it step by step for the classrooms, for fitting the technology that we needed. And what I remember the most was I had to do my homework on the people in Corry and where they were educationally, what their backgrounds were. And unfortunately, I found out early on that 30% of the people that had lost jobs in Corry had not finished high school. And so here we were, hosting Mercyhurst in that building to offer college degree programs to people that hadn't finished high school, that didn't have GEDs. So I remember it was so important for us to bring an adult education program in, which we did, and we pretty much gave them a whole floor, didn't we, Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, third floor. Mm-hmm.
Mary Gall took it over.
Mary Gall took it over, and she not only prepped students to take the GED class, but she taught them life skills. I mean, really basic life skills. And I remember another partnership that came from that was when it came time to offer a nursing program there, we actually had volunteers that came in to babysit and provided childcare for the students that were going in nursing. Talk about partnerships all the way around. It was so positive. It really was.
What's interesting too about the transformation of the Corry Hotel into the Bruce and Arlene Smith Education Center is that from the outside, I mean, even 30 years later, you wouldn't really maybe know anything had happened in that building. And yet it's been 30 years of transformation, and because it wasn't and remains not a natural fit, right? I mean, there was the ground floor that had some open spaces because it had a restaurant in it. But once you get into those upper floors, those were all small little hotel rooms on every floor. So there was a whole lot of knocking walls out and trying to create classrooms. And, it was a great reuse of the building, but I wouldn't say it was a natural reuse of the building. So it took a lot of work. And Peggy, I remember, we shared a common front office assistant in Shelley Rager. You had her, and then when I came on board, and I remember Shelley telling me that, her desk was right there in the front of the ground floor, right up against those big front windows, which, at the time were the original wooden single pane windows from the 1920s when the building was built, and that she recalls coming into work on certain winter days and had snow on her desk.
Snow on her desk, yes. I remember
so
that.
It just blow in around those windows, And
another thing that I remember is I was afraid of the elevator there. because it was the
Well,
old
good
fashioned,
reason.
we cranked it. Shelley loved it. She would always take me up on the elevator. And that elevator's been replaced, right?
Correct.
Yes. What I think was interesting, here's a cute little story. There was a lady that was a doctor that she lived in the house next door. I cannot remember her name. On the corner next to the Bracken Funeral Home.
Yep.
She had one of those lift elevators that she wanted to donate to the Hi-Ed Council, which I thought was really nice. It just it wouldn't have fit in. We couldn't have done it with the structure that was there, but that's how that was there. I mean, everybody wanted to contribute, and that building became very, very important to so many people in the community that otherwise would have not stepped foot in that building.
Right.
Another memory I have, one day there was a tornado watch, and all of a sudden, all these people came in the front door, and I said to Shelley, do these people have appointments here? Are they coming in? Because we had career counseling too. It was the other thing that we set up for early on, so that people could take some assessments and find out where they wanted to go with their educational path. But all these people showed up, and here we found out that the Corry Hotel was designated as a shelter for tornadoes because of the heavy walls that it had. And people went in their building and went down in the basement. Did you remember that, Steve?
No,
It was
I
a
don't
crazy
remember.
day. It was crazy. People just kept filing. It was part of history.
Although it was a perfect tornado shelter because that building is really built.
Solid.
It
Yes.
sure is.
Well, another thing that I found so impressive was the support we got from the Smith Foundation, which I think later became the McGinnis Foundation from McGinnis Steel. Tim Hunter was the vice president there at McGinnis Steel, and he was the administrator for the foundation at the time. And every year they donated funds to nonprofit organizations, and they would look for people to apply. And in the beginning, I didn't know about that process. And I got a call from Tim, and he said, "What do you need for your building?" I said, "Oh my goodness, we need so many things. We need new windows, we need this, we need that." Get an application and have it on my desk by the end of the day. And I did that every year. And we always were granted probably the highest amount of their funding that they provided for Corry every year. That was so impressive to me. And Tim Hunter was a solid support he was on the board, but he was one that would go out of his way to help me in any way I needed. If it meant going and talking to somebody, a potential donor, if it go to a college to work out some partnerships, he was always there for me. And I have to say that was the same case for Bill Nichols, Chip Caldwell, Hoop Roach, Vicki Steck. I mean, there were so many of them that did that sort of thing. Fran Church is another person. She was the librarian. Very, very supportive. Everybody on there was incredibly supportive. I don't think I ever really met as many people that really, really wanted to do the right thing by that building and by the programming than anywhere that I've ever been in my previous careers. So I do remember that. I'm trying to think of some other things that I jotted down that I thought were important. Programming. What I remember was, at first it was a little difficult with Mercyhurst because they wanted to be the only provider. They had put a lot into, that commitment of being there, but they could only provide certain programs. So when I did an assessment of what was needed, I quickly found out they needed a nursing program. So we were able to bring that by another provider, computer program, basic computer programming, which we partnered with Pitt Titusville for. They were very instrumental in helping people get their computer skills going. An engineering program. we found out that there were people working in engineering positions in the major companies there, in the factories, that had never gone to college, past college, and they were providing engineering functions without knowing how they really worked. So Steve, president of McGill, who was that? Steve Mahoney. Steve Mahoney. He said, if you could bring a 2-year engineering program here, we will do everything in our power to support that. And so we did. We brought it. Gannon University provided that. No, I'm sorry. It was Penn State. Penn State. And labs were set up at the high school for that purpose, in the tech school there. And then we offered all the other programming, and we actually offered math skills, special math programs to support those. So about, I want to say 18 graduates graduated from that program. And of course, they enhanced the level of engineering in their companies. That was a very, very successful program. I'm trying to think some of the other things that we did. There's so much that went on all at once. Okay, and that brings me to my friend Linda Detzel, who's sitting next to me right here because we're neighbors. She worked for the Department of Labor and Industry. And so when there were major layoffs or shutdowns, and the one that I can remember the most was Corry Hibert, the furniture place. It had another name though, didn't it?
On Industries.
On Industries. They closed, and they had, how many employees did they have, Linda? Hundreds of employees. Yeah. And they all lost their jobs at once, and they didn't know where to go. It was very, very sad. So Labor and Industry, Linda and her colleagues were sent down there to work with those people. And then eventually they filtered it over to the programs that the Corry Higher Council had, as career counseling and whatever. And eventually they had office space there, didn't you? No. A place to work, but you had a place where you could come in and meet people. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the building was very important to organizations that could help in this whole thing without having to invest in renting office space in the area or whatever.
Or having people travel to Erie or Warren or Meadville.
Right.
Yeah.
They would have had to go travel to other places. So that was very successful. And I remember that there was a fellow that was laid off, or he lost his job at Corry Hibert, who ended up we hired him as our custodian. And again, I can't remember his name, Steve, but you probably can remember.
I've forgotten.
He came in and just did beautiful things with that building. So we ended up being an employer as well as a provider. So those are the things that I remember the most. There's so much more.
Segues, you know, what you were saying, Peggy, about the Department of Labor and Industry made me think too about how, you know, we really tried to become a one-stop shop for the community, because I remember when, you know, the state had an unemployment office right on Main Street there in Corry, and they decided to close that office. But the gentleman who was running the unemployment office in Erie at the time, he was very cooperative, and we said, hey, how can we keep some of these services in Corry? And he helped us, you know, keep up-to-date job listings right there in the lobby of the Higher Ed Council, so that people could still come in and look for jobs without having to go to Erie. And of course, this is pre-internet days, right? So, you know, they were able to do that. We invited other service providers into the building so that people didn't have to travel to Erie for everything that they needed. And it was not only, you know, good for the community, but it was good for the Higher Ed Council, you know, selfishly, because it just got more people in the doors, right? And got more people familiar with the building and to understand that this was a place they could go to get services. And so when the state decided it was going to create the, I've forgotten the job search component.
Was it the
Trying to think of what it was called.
Northwest
Regional. Pennsylvania Career Link.
Yeah.
When it was forming, you know, it was envisioned to be a one-stop shop up in Erie, where they were going to have all these agencies co-locate. And I remember being invited to those organizational meetings up in Erie, where they were talking about this co-location and one-stop shop as this novel idea that they were going to try to put together. And I kind of, it was a nice moment, but I said, oh, yeah, we're doing that in Corry. We've been doing that for a while now. And they were kind of like, what? And yes, yeah, we've been hosting and co-locating and doing a one-stop shop in Corry for quite some time now. So it's great that you're catching on to that idea.
Linda just had a thought too. She wanted to share.
Well, I don't think people understand today that back when all these companies were closing in Corry, the culture was, a young man or a young lady graduated from high school, and they automatically had a job, a very well-paying job at one of these companies very nearby. And then when these companies started closing or relocating, then they had to start rethinking. Well, they can't just walk 2 blocks down the street and they'll have a job. So they had to really start rethinking how they were going to plan the rest of their life and actually where they were going to work. And I think this is where the Higher Ed Council really stepped in to offer these services locally. And it was a whole culture change, I think, for the whole town.
Right.
Because it just changed the way you had to look at things in your life.
Absolutely.
And having that one-stop shop type of a setup was so beneficial to those folks. Like, Steve pointed out, instead of having to go to this building, that building, go into Erie, go to Warren to get access those services, because when people did that, they lost interest after a while. Come in there and they got support, and it was constant and it was there, it was present. So that was very, very important to the growth of the Corry Higher Ed Council, definitely.
And speaking of the growth of the Higher Ed Council, not only recognized locally, as it's been very well documented and stated here in our conversation, but at the state level too as well. And Steve, maybe you can comment on this. 1998 and 2012 were very significant years for the community education councils across the Commonwealth in terms of just really overall stability and growth. What was some of the state legislation, or what were some of the state legislation that was established during that time period that really galvanized or made legitimacy there for our regional CECs? Would you be able to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I was hired in 1996. Oh, and I want to thank Peggy for that, as I have over time. But just to kind of step back for a second, I recall as I was covering the Higher Ed as a reporter, one day, Peggy had been there, 5 years or so, and we were talking, and she said something to the effect of, "Hey, I'm not thinking about leaving or anything, but if I ever did, I think you'd be good at this job." And I was kind of surprised, and I had never thought of anything like that. And it was just nice to hear that from somebody I respected. And that was about all I thought of that. And then, I don't know, probably a couple months later, maybe not even that long, she told me, she said, "Hey, remember that conversation we had? Well, I am going to move to another job, and I think you should apply for this job." And so I did, and it was, the best break of my professional career. So I just want to, as long as I have this opportunity, to thank Peggy again for that, because
they made the right decision.
It was a transformational thing in my life. But so, not long after I got the job, and keeping in mind there were 5 what we call original community education councils, or CECs. The first was in Warren. Corry was the second in 1991, followed very closely by the Elk Cameron Community Education Council in St. Mary's, and then by the Potter County Education Council over in the Coudersport area, and then the 5th one in Oil City, Venango County. So there were 5 of kind of what we consider the 5 original education councils. And so when I came on board in 96, I think they'd already been talking, maybe, or shortly thereafter decided that we wanted to see if we could get state legislation passed that really codified what these community education councils were, and because we were really just 5 independent, autonomous nonprofits kind of scattered around the state, that John Peterson and other legislators were trying to cobble together funding for us through a line item that Senator Peterson had in the state budget called rural initiatives. So really kind of vague, and he would try to put some money in that each year and get that out to the education councils. And we thought, if we could get legislation passed, that could really help solidify our existence. So that became the next big initiative. And I can remember Hoop Roach saying that Dr. Bill Garvey, the president of Mercyhurst University, kind of poo-pooed the idea of us being able to get state legislation passed because, we're just these little nonprofits out in the middle of nowhere. But with primarily Senator Peterson's help and the assistance of a state representative in Warren, State Representative Jim Lynch, over the period of a year or so, we actually got this legislation written, and it passed the state legislature and was signed into law. And it again, like I said, it really codified what these education councils were, who we reported to, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and how we operate. And one of the important things that was in the legislation was that we were to be institutionally neutral, so that we didn't have a alignment with any specific educational provider. We represented the communities, our communities, and just going out and finding all the partnerships that we could find, educational partnerships to bring into our communities. So when we got that legislation passed in 1998, it really got people's attention to the point that we grew the CEC movement across the state, and now there are 9 community education councils. And because I think purely from a pragmatic perspective, I think people said, oh, they've got legislation, and oh, they've got a line item in the budget, and oh, maybe we should look at having one of those too, but there was need for them. I mean, and this goes back to historically Pennsylvania starting but never completing its community college system. So it started community colleges in the 1960s, the idea that they would be built out all across the state and serve all regions. And they really only got about, up to Interstate 80. And then because of the way the legislation was written about how they needed to be funded by these local communities, these rural communities and counties just could never really create them. So there was this huge swath of Pennsylvania, typically pretty much north of I-80, that really had very little, if any, access to higher education, workforce training, and that kind of thing. So these community education councils really were created to try to fill those voids and serve those gaps. So we got this legislation passed in 1998, and that really helped us. So as we would collectively, the education councils, go to Harrisburg each year at budget time to kind of what I refer to as do our dog and pony show with legislators and staff members in the Capitol, they started to understand who we were and what we did. And it was a long process. I mean, every year that we went down, we would have to educate more and more people. But finally, we realized, as we were going down after several years, we would meet with these people and we'd go, oh, well, we represent the community education councils. I don't know if you know what those are. And more people were saying, oh, yeah, we know what you are. Yep, we know what you do. So we were slowly being recognized as being kind of part of the fabric of the state educational delivery system. And I could see that happening kind of gradually over time. But one of the problems was that we were viewed, and this was kind of a weird thing about the state, that I came to learn over time, but we were viewed as what they called a legislative initiative, that we were created by the state legislators, and the state administrations, which would be the various governors over time, their staffs, et cetera, didn't necessarily see us that way. They didn't necessarily see us as being this, legitimate part of the educational fabric or whatever. So what would happen would be that every time a governor would propose their proposed budget in February each year, every governor for 12, 14 years would propose to either significantly cut or eliminate our funding, zero out our line item. And one of the reasons I think that they did that was because they recognized that there were now a bunch of state legislators who supported these community education councils. So the governors felt that if they, eliminated or reduced that funding, it gave them a bargaining chip. Okay, you want this funding back for these ed councils? Here's something I want. So we became a political football, and it was a bit nerve-wracking every year to have that happen. We finally, kind of came to recognize that our legislators were going to restore that funding, but it meant that we were never in a position where we could ask for an increase, because we were always just fighting to get back to level funding, right? So, and that was through Tom Ridge and everybody else, Republicans, Democrats, it didn't really matter. They just saw us as this bargaining chip, I think. So the next key development for us in that came in, I think it was 2012, when Governor Tom Corbett was in office, and his proposed state budget came out in February, and of course we were waiting for that to see how much he was going to propose to cut us or eliminate us or whatever. And lo and behold, we were level funded in his proposed budget, and I almost fell over when I saw it. And then every year thereafter, with Corbett and then his successors, we were level funded in those proposed governor's budgets. And that was a huge moment for us. We could not only, again, just on a funding level, to not have to keep fighting for level funding and now be able to think about trying to get some additional funding, but it meant that the administration now recognized us as a legitimate part of the education and workforce training delivery system in the state. So between the original legislation in '98 and then Governor Corbett flat funding us and kind of recognizing us in that way in 2012, those were a couple of really key moments for us. And then really after that, we would go down to Harrisburg each year to lobby for our funding, and pretty much everybody knew who we were, which told me, we'd really kind of arrived. It took a long time. What was it, 25 years at that point? And it was a very gradual process. And we really had to work it every year and work it all along those paths. But finally, they really did. The state said, okay, we get it. We understand what you're doing. We support it. We want to fund you. So those are a couple of key moments for us.
And I remember going back during the 5 years that I was there, Hoop Roach called me one day and said, I think we need to go down to the state capitol and talk to people. And I said, okay, I agree. So he and I went down to Harrisburg 2 days. We walked the Capitol building. We went to representatives' offices. We went to the senators' offices, whatever we had to do to create that awareness. So it took time to do it, but it had to be done because you just could not live with that walking around money every year. And it was a little on the political side at that time. So I was so happy to hear that that came back, or that you were able to get in the state funding and on the budget. That was very, very important.
And along those same lines, when I was at the Corry Journal and Peggy was running the Hi-Ed, I recognized what an important initiative this was. So I tried to give it as much press as I could to kind of keep it in the public eye. And I can remember going down and talking to Peggy, and she would say something like, well, I hope we're going to get some funding soon because I don't know how we're going to keep our doors open. And then a couple of weeks later, John Peterson would show up with a check for $10,000, you know, and I mean, that was the kind of hand-to-mouth existence that it was. And when I got the job in September of '96, even then in '96, you know, so the organization had been around for 5 years, but in '96, I took the job in September, and by December, only 3-4 months later, I thought I might have to lay myself off. You know, that's how close it all was, all during that time period, until we were able to solidify, you know, that line item in the state budget and solidify some funding. So, you know, it just tells you how tenuous it all was, but how important it was to the community that they kept fighting, they kept supporting it, they kept lobbying, they kept coming up with funding. Those foundations kept stepping in and helping. I mean, it was really a feel-good, heartwarming thing to be part of. You know, it was really, really a wonderful thing.
It really was, because we could see the tangible results. We could see what happened with people. They got jobs, they were more self-assured. And then we had providers that wanted to come in. We didn't have to go and ask them, they were calling us. We'd like to offer, you know, the Manufacturers Association offered their supervisory programs, and then they had youth programming eventually. All across the board, there was respect for what was being offered there. And we tried to keep politics out of it. We really did a very good job of that.
So much has changed in just the 30 years, what we've all talked about. You've talked about the evolution and transition of the organization overall. But Corry Hi-Ed still remains as a relevant educational provider. This question really goes to you both. Why are community education councils like Corry Hi-Ed still vital to communities like Corry? In your opinion, why do you think that they remain relevant for the services and the mission that they provide for the communities in which they're in?
Go ahead, Peggy.
I think it's because of the leadership support that came, grassroots support from the community. Very seldom do you see that kind of cooperation amongst people. And Corry is a great example of people coming together for the good of the community. And it really has been a very beneficial, positive thing for Corry. I still run into people sometimes from Corry that always remember me from there, and they thank me, you know. So glad that we were able to, you know, have that building, keep that building going for whatever reasons they thought about it. And my son went there and got a degree, or that leadership training that you provided for the community after I left, Steve. I think that's a great thing. So you can raise up leaders in the community that will keep this going. It's a very unusual community, I think, and has a lot of respect. So that's what I remember. I just wish that every place could be that way. As a matter of fact, you know, you heard all the efforts about the Erie Community College, getting a community college, and Steve and I have talked about that from time to time. And I even said Erie could benefit from a higher education council type of a model if they wanted to work with all providers, because one of the things that's prohibited a community college from being in Erie County or in the whole Northwest Pennsylvania is the competition that would come from that. But if you pull together and provide what's needed, I think it could work. So that's what I think. And Linda, you had some points that you wanted to say about how, when you were involved there, and how Corry pulled together and
right. Again, it comes to the fact that, you know, when we would have these meetings with these people that were losing their jobs, you would look at their faces and they didn't know what to do next. They had never had to write a resume. Some of them didn't have their GED. And I think having it locally there in the community really was kind of a rallying point for these people, because they were lost. They had never experienced this kind of a situation before. And having worked with the Higher Ed Council, we could encourage them at the meeting, and Peg would be at all my meetings when I met with these various companies' employees that were going to lose their jobs in 90 days. So yeah, being there in the community and having the reputation that you can go there and you can get some help or advice was very important.
Yeah, and I would second everything that was just said. And I think, you know, what made the Ed Council model succeed was that it was local. It was always there. We represented those communities. And I think the businesses, the manufacturers, everybody recognized that, you know, we weren't some outside entity that was coming in to save the day at some particular moment. We were part of them. We were part of the fabric, and they wanted to support that because they knew who we were. So I think that that's really been the key. We were local. We were always there. We represented their interests. And you know, I'm going to regress just one more time here, but it wasn't long after I became executive director that I broached to our board of directors about the idea of changing the name of the organization. And because it was called the Corry Higher Education Council, and because I think that when it was organized and created, that the idea, what everybody was thinking, as Peggy had alluded to earlier, everybody was thinking this was going to be a kind of a college thing, you know, Mercyhurst and other types of higher education in that respect. And you know, I hadn't been on board all that long when I realized how much more it had become than that. To reflect some of the prior conversation, that you know, one of my favorite programs over the years was the GED prep program, because I could just see how getting a GED was changing people's lives. And so, you know, I was looking at, you know, what we were delivering, what we were making available to the community, and it was so much more than I think what we would typically consider higher education. It was workforce training. It was, you know, the career counseling. It was, you know, basic computer skills. You know, it's just so much. And so, you know, our board started engaging in that conversation about changing the name. And it was kind of funny because even 5 years in a smaller community like Corry, I would still have people say, so what are you down there? And I'm sure Peggy had that all the time. You know, what do you do down there? What is it again? And so we knocked it around a little bit, the name thing. And it finally dawned on me that, you know what, we were just getting people to understand what we were and what we did. So not really the smartest time to change your name again. So we thought it's good. People are starting to recognize it. We're going to keep Corry Higher Education Council, but it became so much more. I mean, and again, just reflecting the needs of the community, right? I mean, and I'm sure Peggy was the same way. Anytime somebody walked in and said, hey, have you ever thought about doing this? I'd say, gee, I'd never thought about that, but we could sure take a look at it, you know, and that's all it would take. We didn't have to have committees, and we didn't have to have, you know, a lot long conversations. And, you know, I remember a lady coming in one time and asking about continuing education for people who worked in bars and restaurants as far as liquor control board training went for serving alcohol. I said, geez, I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know you had to have that, but let us look into that. And we did. And, you know, within 6 months, we were offering training for those folks. So, and that's, you know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, Brody and Peggy, but it's what has made it so much fun to work there, because you could just have an idea, and in a couple of months, you could have something up and running. Right. And the board was always so supportive, you know, and the community backed stuff. And so, you know, how often do you get to do that in your lifetime? So,
you know, I have to say it was the most gratifying position I've ever had in my life, to see how you could just, if you had done your homework and you knew it was needed and you were able to provide it without politics, without money, without all those things you have to worry about. It happened at Corry Higher Council just because of the people involved there in that community.
And to your original question, Brody, about, what makes us relevant even 30 years later, that's what makes us relevant. There's always going to be some kind of needs. It's going to ebb and flow. Introduction to computers is going away, but there'll always be something. And we'll be there. The Hi-Ed will be there to react and respond to it.
Steve, when I first came on, you told me, I think one of the first things in our first conversations, just about trying to give a snapshot of what the Hi-Ed is to the community. And the best way that you put it, and I'll never forget this, is just that we are many things to many people. Education and training close to home is just something that is so pivotal and has been such a catalyst for community advancement. Over the last 30 years, we're involved in many things, and we still are, as an organization, for driving change and the betterment for the community. And as far as the overall mission of the organization, and maybe we'll just end with this final thought in this question for you both as we wrap up our presentation here today and our conversation. Just talking about that, with over the past 3 decades of helping grow the community with education and training close to home, as your respective time as directors, what do you think, or what do you believe is the single greatest accomplishment of the council in fulfilling its mission to the community?
Well, I'd like to say getting in the state budget has to be very significant.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say, I think of single accomplishment as something like Peggy just referred to, but I'm going to turn it a little bit and to say that I would say that the greatest maybe single accomplishment of the Education Council has been that it's really created a culture in the Corry area of continuous improvement and continuing education and personal improvement that I don't think existed in the Corry area before the Education Council was formed. And it's taken a long time, to really kind of to get there. But I think now that culture of personal growth and community improvement and business and manufacturing improvement, and that where there is a catalyst for that culture of education and training and personal growth, to me, that's I think the single greatest thing that the Education Council has done for the region.
And I ditto that, Steve. I do. Absolutely. That's it.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today, and Linda for your contributions too as well. I do know that, having come on in November of 2018, the organization was in fantastic hands. And it's all due to the fact of great leadership that we've had over the last 30 years here, in your contributions to the community and to the growth of the opportunities that exist here through the council and its mission to provide education and training here close to home. And we're so very grateful. And, I take that very seriously, and continuing to enhance the legacy of the council and to grow it to serve many more. So thank you both for all that you've done here for the community and the organization. And thank you for joining us today. I know this is something that we've been talking about for a while and trying to capture, the great and the rich history of the organization to share with many, but for 30 plus more years to come. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. And I also would encourage our audience to join us on Friday, June 4th, from 5 to 9 p.m. as a part of the First Fridays event here in the Corry community, to join us for an outdoor celebration of the last 30 years here as we celebrate the incorporation and the existence of the council. We'll provide more information about that over the coming weeks as we leading up to this and the time that this program airs on our various social media platforms and on our website. So stay tuned for more information, and we look forward to sharing this celebration with all of you. Thanks again for joining us today, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brody.